So welcome everyone to this seminar on the impact of COVID-19 on data collection for social surveys. This is the second of two events which have been organised by the RSS Social Statistics Section Committee. My name is Ria Sanderson and I'll be chairing the session today. So just by way of an introduction, I'm sure you're all very aware of this already, but the COVID-19 pandemic has had a substantial impact on social surveys. And with the initial lockdown restrictions that came into effect in March, survey organisations had to quickly stop face-to-face interviewing. As the pandemic's continued, survey organisations have had to adapt and evolve to enable the continued collection of data about people and households, and to introduce new surveys to provide insights into the effect of the pandemic on society. But all this has come at a time when our understanding of society is of greater interest than perhaps ever before, as we're using data from social surveys to understand the impact of the pandemic on our daily lives. So this period has brought a great number of challenges, but it also seems to have brought a number of opportunities to those organisations that carry out social surveys. In last week's seminar, we heard about the challenges and opportunities for alternative approaches to face-to-face interviewing for social surveys, as well as the impact on how qualitative research is carried out. And today, we're going to hear presentations from Ian O'Sullivan at ONS, Jonathan Burton from the Institute for Social and Economic Research, and Stuart Grant and Joel Williams from Kantar. I'd just like to mention a couple of housekeeping points. So this session is being recorded. If you'd like to have any contribution you make to the session removed, please contact Luz Martinez at the RSS. And I believe she'll put her email address in the chat box so that that's available. Can I also ask that you keep your video off and keep yourselves on mute throughout the session? And also we'd welcome questions to the presenters, but if I can ask you to submit those through the chat box within Microsoft Teams, and then I can collate them and ask them of each speaker at the end of the presentation. So I think we probably should make a start. So I'd like to start by introducing Ian O'Sullivan, who's the Assistant Deputy Director in the Social Surveys Transformation Division at ONS, who's going to be speaking about redesigning ONS social surveys in the face of the pandemic. So Ian, can I hand over to you now, please?
Well, thanks very much for inviting me to come and speak today about what we've been getting up to in ONS over the pandemic period. As Ria introduced me, I'm Ian O'Sullivan and I work in Social Survey Transformation Division. As I say, it's been nice to be invited to come and speak with you folks today. So just a few slides. I've got about 18 slides in total, and I think I've got about 20 minutes. So I'll go through them fairly fast. But the first thing I wanted to do was just to give a little bit of context to some of the work that I've been doing over the last number of years and what we've actually been doing since the beginning of the pandemic as well. The slide on the screen in front of you is a quotation from the ONS business case for the Census and Data Collection Transformation Programme. So ONS has got a substantial statistical transformation programme that's been running for a number of years now. And the work of the division I work in, Social Survey Transformation Division, is entirely funded and dedicated to the delivery of a transformed data collection for social surveys. And there's two kind of key points associated with that quote that we can draw out. One is that ONS would like to and is aiming to use more admin data sources in the future as a primary source of data for statistical outputs, and wants thereby to reduce its reliance on large population and business surveys. So that's kind of a key objective, and that is of course only where it's possible and sensible to do that. And while there's a desire to reduce our reliance on social surveys, reduce does not mean eliminate, and there absolutely will still remain a place for survey data collection as part of our future model. So that's one point. And then the second point to draw out is that ONS doesn't have or hasn't had online capability for household surveys in recent years. And we would like to move, again, where possible and where sensible, to a digital by default or an online approach for survey data collection. And it's the survey element and the move online element that myself and my team have been focused on over the last number of years. So what's in scope of the Social Survey Transformation Programme? Well, all of those continuous surveys that you've got on the screen there in front of you are in scope. The Labour Force Survey, the Opinions and Lifestyle Survey, and the three financial surveys that ONS runs, the Living Cost of Food Survey, The income and living condition survey and wealth and assets are all within scope of the transformation programme, and we've made varying degrees of progress in relation to the transformation of those particular surveys, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about that shortly. Online collection is a key feature of what we're doing, and by focusing on online collection and by focusing on an online first approach, we've had a massive investment into actually question and questionnaire redesign to enable good quality data to be collected via a self-completion first approach. And then one other feature of the work we're doing is actually it's kind of the almost the golden fleece that statistical organisations have been chasing for many years, is actually survey integration. We're looking across the whole household survey portfolio, and we have an ambition to deliver an integrated survey framework where all the surveys are part of that single statistical framework. So that's within scope of what we're doing as well. Now, some of you will have heard me talk about this in the past in various other forums, so I will go through this very quickly. But that is a kind of an image of what we're calling the Integrated Population and Characteristics Survey, and in effect, that's the golden thread that or the golden fleece that we're chasing. We have it's a schema of an integrated survey model for all of all of ONS's household survey collection requirements. So it's referred to as IPACS, the Integrated Population and Characteristics Survey. I mean, that's a working title, and it's certainly something that we wouldn't use on the doorstep, or it's certainly not a brand. But in effect, this is a framework that we're looking to develop. So I won't go into it in any detail, but the key thing to take a look at is that you've got a big horizontal rectangle in the middle there, which says wave 1 master wave. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to issue a sample of approximately 500,000 households per year at that wave 1 survey. And the content of that survey, which would be online first with face-to-face and telephone collection as well, the content of that survey would include socio-demographic and characteristics data, core labour market content, and also coverage data that would be required for population coverage survey purposes. So you'll be aware that ONS has also got a big research programme into looking into potentially the 2021 being the last traditional population count in the UK, and population coverage survey requirements are kind of a key requirement for a future admin data-based population stat system. So we're trying to integrate household data requirements and population coverage survey data requirements into a single framework here as well. So we're anticipating having a wave 1 or an initial master wave survey on the scale of 500,000 households a year, and response response to that master wave would then actually serve as a sampling frame for any other survey modules that we might have, and that would include longitudinal labour market modules, potentially some of the household finance surveys, opinions, health education. It could be anything really, but in effect, we want to use response to the master wave as a frame for other survey data collection. There's a whole seminar based around IPACS in itself, but that's just a very quick overview of what we think we'd like to do. So if I'm going to step back from the integrated framework piece for the moment, so as I pointed out, quite a number of our household surveys are in scope of the social survey transformation programme. So up until the end of 2019 or early 2020, what sort of progress had we made? Well, on the opinions and lifestyle survey, the opinions and lifestyle survey has been run by ONS for about 30 years now, and for the vast majority of that period, it was a face-to-face interview. So actually, the survey has gone through quite a substantial redesign phase, which has included redesigning the questionnaire content and other core elements of the survey, with the view that we'd like to build move away from a face-to-face collection design and move it to an online first with other modes of collection follow-up where necessary. So lots of redesign of the core question content to enable a self-completion online mode. 3 different pilot tests, quant tests, were conducted to understand the impact of changing mode. And we switched from an interview-led face-to-face mode of collection in April 2018, and it went from face-to-case into our telephone unit in the first instance. We also changed our approach to sampling at that point, and we started to sample for the opinion survey from the labour force survey. And then by the back end of 2019, we actually introduced an online first approach to that design. So we started 2020 with a mixed mode online first opinion survey. And as you can see at the end of the slide, which will be shared by the committee afterwards, there's a link to the report, to some of the reports that we published, which have outlined the work that we've done towards the transformation of the opinion survey. So that's where we were by the beginning of March 2020 on the opinion survey. On the labour force survey, I mean, clearly the labour force survey is a much bigger and potentially, arguably more serious beast than the omnibus opinion survey. Again, the researchers followed a similar process, but on a much more substantial and methodical scale in some respects. We've done a lot of reevaluation of what the core requirements of a future labour market survey might be. And we've taken a very, very comprehensive respondent-centric redesign approach to the questionnaire content. So we haven't simply lifted and shifted LFS content LFS content into an online mode of collection. There's been quite a bit of redesign work done to optimize the design of the questions for an online first approach. We've done quite a number of large-scale tests to help us to understand how to maximize online uptake. And that was over the period 2017 to 2019. And that also included a longitudinal online-only attrition, the attrition test, as we called it. So while we understood quite well by the back end of 2018 how you can get people to go online and how best to engage with them, and incentivize them to achieve about 30% uptake online first. We also conducted an online attrition test as well to see actually how we could keep those people who went online at wave 1, keep them coming back at waves 2+. And we're good, excuse me, and we've got a report coming out on the findings of that attrition test towards the middle of December. But while we've done quite a lot of research into understanding online uptake, the big step for us to take after that was to understand mixed mode response and to indeed evaluate the redesigned questionnaire in terms of some of our labour market estimates. So to that end, we conducted a large-scale mixed mode test online first with face-to-face follow-up, working with Ipsos Mori in 2018-19, and overall uptake in response to that questionnaire was just shy of 61%. In terms of the responding sample distribution, it was broadly comparable with the LFS over the same period. There were minimal age differences, but the LFS tended to be slightly older. And at that point in time, in that particular cross-sectional test, the labour market survey achieved a reasonably more equitable coverage in terms of deprivation as measured by the index of multiple deprivation. And we also had less proxy data on the labour market survey as well. That was another one of the findings. We looked at some of the key labour market estimates that we could produce from the LFS from the same period. Now, these are unpublished LFS estimates because they're from a particular time frame. That's not part. So there were significant differences between the LMS estimates and the LFS in terms of the numbers of students in full-time education. Where there were fewer people counted in as self-employed in the LMS. And there were differences also in terms of the number of hours worked and the average number of hours estimated by the LMS. So there were some significant differences between the two surveys. But there were no significant differences in terms of the four key labour market estimates that our colleagues in Labour Market Division are particularly interested in. There were no differences in terms of employment, unemployment, economic activity, and in terms of the numbers of full-time and part-time employees. And again, there's a link here to the report that was published in January 2020. So that all of that sort of was a kind of a quick reflection on our journey in relation to the opinion survey and the labour market survey as part of this transformation programme. So we got to the beginning of this year and we had lots of plans to do further statistical investigation of the data we collected from that mixed mode test. I mean, it was certainly not a dress rehearsal. It was a test, which would certainly have an impact on where we were going to go in terms of the design of the LMS. But we were also working up plans to deliver a mixed mode longitudinal test of the LMS in 2020 to start testing integrating or integrative submodule design as part of that longitudinal test. And then also we were thinking we might need to start preparing towards the back end of this year for a potential parallel run of the labour market survey. So, 4 bullets, and that was what we had planned for 2020. And then, of course, COVID threw all that up in the air. Everybody knows, everybody across the sector has gone through quite some similar experiences in terms of face-to-face collection for household surveys. It was paused in ONS on the 17th of March. And while face-to-face collection paused on household surveys, demand for new data to help inform the government's response and the understanding the impact of the virus on the general public went through the roof. So there was some information available from admin data sources that ONS had, but there was no data available from any of the social surveys that we had at that point. So as part of the response to the pandemic, my team were asked to take that fairly immature. I mean, it was being developed, and we were being diligent about the development of the labour market survey. But my team were asked to launch the labour market survey online immediately, or certainly as soon as we could, and we refer to that as the LMS Beta product. So that's an online-only version of the LMS, and we were asked to do that as a kind of a potential alternative source of the LFS labour market data should LFS response rates fall through the floor. ONS hasn't had to use the labour market survey data that we've been collecting for those purposes, but it was part of the contingency planning just in case we did need an alternative source. So the content of that survey includes core labour market data that we had, core labour market questions that we had redesigned and previously tested, and also we collected additional COVID-related labour market content. It's online only, and we issue a sample of 1,500 households a week on that LMS Beta product. And it's continuous and it's longitudinal. So since the beginning of April, when it went live, we've issued 1,500 cases at wave 1 per week. We've been achieving around 40% uptake on average at wave 1, and we're now going into wave 3 in the longitudinal design. On the opinion survey, as I say, had been transformed to a mixed mode online first with telephone follow-up design, but it was monthly. And actually, the requirement for data was so great that we had to redesign the operating model for the opinion survey so that we could deliver it weekly, and that was end to end, from taking requirements on a Monday to actually designing them and testing them and launching for data collection online first by the Thursday later that week. So initially, a huge effort went into transforming and further transforming the design of the opinion survey to meet those additional data demands, and it was online only with some telephone nudging. We also initially sampled we also selected the sample from the LMS. So actually, for the opinion survey, instead of continuing to sample for the LFS, we boosted the wave 1 LMS sample. So as I said, for the LMS, we had a sample of 1,500 a week for longitudinal labour market purposes, and we boosted that wave 1 sample by 10,000 per week. And response to that cohort of wave 1 labour market cases was fed into the opinion survey. So that's been operating since, again, late March, and there's a new weekly series published from the opinion survey to help understand the impact of the virus in GB. And then I'll just flick through this very quickly. We've also launched since then the COVID infection survey that launched in April. It aims to work out how many people already have had COVID, and it helps track the current extent of infection and transmission. The sample for the COVID infection survey, again, is also selected from the labour market survey, not the LFS, from the labour market survey. So again, we boosted the wave 1 labour market survey by a further 23,000 households per week. So we have had, I beg your pardon, we have had 1,500 cases per week issued for the LMS longitudinal design, a further 10,000 labour market survey wave 1 cases to feed into the opinion survey in effect at wave 2, and a further 23,000 labour market cases issued at wave 1 to feed into the COVID infection survey in effect at a wave 2. So what we've actually ended up with is an integrated population and characteristics survey. We have a very, very large scale wave 1 labour market survey, and the content of that includes sociodemographics, characteristics, labour market and population coverage survey content. We're issuing about 35,000 households, 35,000 cases per week to that online only design. And response to that is then feeding long submodules, longitudinal labour market submodules, an opinion survey module, and the COVID infection survey as a module. So what we've actually ended up with at the end of November 2020 is a very, very fledgling version of what our strategic long-term model was. So we have a large-scale wave 1 with submodules coming off that response to that large-scale wave 1. There's still a long way to go in terms of the further design and development of this, not least because it's a single mode of collection. But we've certainly been enabled by the pandemic to take some substantial steps forward towards this model. So perhaps I shouldn't say it, but never let a good crisis go to waste, as Sir Winston Churchill is noted as saying. As a consequence of the pandemic, we've launched the LMS Beta Survey, and that is live and operational now, and there are no plans at all to decommission that. That will continue. So in effect, we are collecting labour market data as part of a parallel run, albeit a very limited parallel run already. The opinion survey has been transformed and integrated into that design, as has the COVID infection survey. So we've actually, as a consequence of the pandemic, taken some substantial steps forward towards the delivery of an online first integrated statistical model for ONS's household surveys. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I'm just having a look in the chat bar. I can't see any questions that have been asked, so I just wanted to give the audience an opportunity to ask any questions of Ian at this point. If not, I might just ask Ian for your reflections, perhaps a little bit on what's been achieved over that period of time, because obviously you set out your plans for the year, as I guess many of us did, and find yourself in kind of a different position. And it'd be interesting just to hear what you think that means for that wider transformation programme.
So I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword, if I tell the truth, Ria. It's been a real enabler of progress, which is what I wanted to try and convey in the presentation. It's allowed us to take more risk in terms of some of the things we were planning to do. But I think what has perhaps not been as well appreciated is the effort that had gone into. So now there's an expectation that we can do things quite a lot quicker than perhaps we would ideally like to. So I think there's been some positives in terms of kind of leapfrogging in some respects some of the potential barriers. We have a longitudinal labour market survey now. It is a single mode, but it's operational, and it's further unblocking some barriers to some of the kind of the capability challenges we have to delivering mixed mode. We've got a good case to make, but it needs a little bit more management in terms of actually not making decisions around that as the actual alternative without some more sort of rigor around kind of the evaluation of it. So sorry, I'm conscious I'm rambling on a little bit, but I think with some risk, I think, is the way to leave it.
Thanks, Ian. I think you dropped out just slightly at the end of what you were saying there, but I think we got the gist of it. Thank you. I've just noticed we've got a couple of questions now. If I can I might ask them all as one because they're sort of related. So using online only, how representative is the achieved sample at wave 1? And what proportion of people who are interviewed at wave 1 are happy to be recontacted?
Okay, sorry. So I just lost you a little bit there. So just going to scroll through. Sorry, what was that first question, Ria?
So the first question is, how representative is the achieved sample at wave 1?
Oh, I mean, it's biased. I mean, it's biased online. I mean, it's absolutely not sufficient, Sam, to rely and to even think about a single mode of collection for any survey. So it is biased. It's an older sample for a start. So we absolutely have to think of mixed mode as part of this design. And in 2021, I've lost track of where we are, but in 2021 we are looking to introduce an knock-to-nudge telephone mode as part of that design for Wave 1 LMS.
We've also got a question about the proportion of people who are happy to be recontacted, and also about the incentive for online.
Yeah, so we're achieving about 70% 70% response at wave 2 of those people who responded online at wave 1, and we've got a report coming out on that just before Christmas on some testing we did earlier last year on that, but we're getting about 70-75% coming back to us at wave 2. We did quite a lot of experimenting previously on how to try and keep people interested in participating online at waves 2+, and that's why we've invested so heavily as well in the design of the actual questionnaire, because if you give people a bad experience at wave 1, you're certainly not going to get them coming back online at wave 2. So we've done quite a lot on that, Chris. And then Shanna, yes, high response rate for online. We have we offer, I don't know if it's an incentive, but in the initial, we include a tote bag, a free gift, a tote bag with a sort of a nice brand on it, a nice design on it. We don't know if that's incentivizing people to go online, but it certainly gets people interested because it's squishy in an envelope, and you get people opening the envelope and therefore engaging with the invitation. So it may or may not be incentivizing that tote bag, but it certainly seems to have an effect. We're also currently offering a £15 conditional incentive to participation on the LMS. When we launched at the beginning of the pandemic, that was actually quite a bit higher. It was £25, but which is very, very large, and I don't think would work as part of a mixed mode survey design. We've reduced that to £15 now, and the actual response rates have held up around the 40% overall. But we will have to review that as we introduce other modes of collection into the design as well.
Thanks, Ian. And I think we've got time for just the one last question. So could you say something more about the LMS? So how large is the sampling base? Is it UK-wide? And what's the response to various modules? a question
So
on slide.
the LMS is UK wide. It is we're operational across all 4 countries. And response to the modules on the opinion survey, I know that one. I don't know what response to the COVID infection survey is off the top of my head, but it is achieving 70-75% at that sub-module, that opinion sub-module at wave 2. So it's in line with the response I gave to the other question about attrition earlier. And what links are there to the LFS? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, but the LMS aims to produce the core labour market estimates that the current LFS produces. The content of the LMS is not finalised. It's still being negotiated and worked on from a design point of view. There's more content to be included, so it will become a longer interview. But it's currently about 15 minutes in length, and we think that there's potentially 5 to 10 more minutes worth of labour market content to be added in.
Thanks, Ian. I can see you've had another question, but I think we're going to have to move on just so we can get through the remaining speakers. But if we've got some time at the end, perhaps we can return to that question if that's okay with everyone.
Yeah.
So thank you, Ian. I'd now like to welcome Jonathan Burton, who's Associate Director for Surveys at the Institute for Social and Economic Research, who's going to be speaking to us about adapting the UK Household Longitudinal Survey. I can pass over to Jonathan.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Jonathan Burton from Institute for Social and Economic Research. I'm the Associate Director for Surveys for Understanding Society, and I want to talk today about the impact of the COVID pandemic on data collection, the challenges and opportunities that we've experienced. So first, a bit about Understanding Society. It's the UK Household Longitudinal Study. It's representative of the UK population, so it includes Northern Ireland, Highlands and Islands and Scotland. It began in 2009, but it does incorporate the British Household Panel survey sample, which started in 1991. And at wave 11, which is sort of where we're at the moment, it's approximately 22,500 households, just over 40,000 adults. And the key point of Understanding Society is we have annual interviews with the same people over time, and we obviously follow them if they move, and we interview new entrants into the household. There's a household questionnaire, and then we ask everyone aged 16 and above to do an individual adult interview that's used self-completion for 10 to 15-year-olds. Now, the fieldwork for each wave is spread over 2 years. So the sample we have is split into 8 quarterly subsamples. So this means there's actually quite a long gap between when we're planning the survey and when the data comes out. And this could be seen as one of the limitations when you're interested in COVID-19 research. So for example, we started planning the content for wave 10, trying to identify priority topics late in 2016. We were then developing those during 2017, writing the questionnaire. It was being scripted by Kantar, we were testing it. Fieldwork started January 2018 and finished sort of mid-May 2020. And the data deposit, it's with the data archive now, and it should be out in a few weeks' time. So it's 4 years between the start of planning the survey and data release. So we have this long production cycle. We do have continuous fieldwork, so we have this overlapping wave design. So although each wave of fieldwork takes over 2 years to collect in the field, each adult is issued every year. So it's an annual survey. So this does limit some practical feasibility of changing content mid-wave. It's a study that's designed to be very agile and flexible. It's very difficult to sort of change things sort of mid-wave. And we also want to keep balance between having questions consistent within the wave. So if we suddenly change a question halfway through a wave, it means for half of that sample, we don't have the response to that question. And so we're really inclined to sort of try and keep the annual interview fairly consistent, and researchers can use things like the date of interview to analyze how things changed during the COVID period. So the impact of COVID-19 it meant that when we suspended face-to-face interviewing mid-March 2020, we had 3 waves in the field. So wave 10 was just coming to an end. They were sort of in the telephone mop-up period. Wave 11, we were partway through year 2. Wave 12 had started earlier that year. So we had 3 waves, all at different stages. But one advantage that we have on Understanding Society is that the study already uses a mixed mode data collection. So just to go back a bit about sort of mixed mode, when the study started in 2009, it was a face-to-face survey, and it was a face-to-face survey for the first 6 waves. A telephone mop-up was introduced during wave 3, so this is just where we weren't able to contact people face-to-face. We'd try and telephone them at the end of fieldwork. Wave 7 is when we first brought in web. So we invited adults who were in households that didn't respond at wave 6. We invited them to take part online, and people who did not respond online were then followed up face-to-face. And then from wave 8 onwards, so from 2016, we rolled out this web-first design for an increasing proportion of the sample. In the last few waves, it's about 70% of the sample which is issued web-first. So these are people who get a letter and an email inviting them to take part online. After 5 weeks, that sample is then issued to interviewers. We do have 20% of households which are ring-fenced to be face-to-face. They've always been face-to-face. And we also kept face-to-face for an increasingly small proportion of households that we modelled as being low propensity web households. So these were households that we thought were very unlikely to take part online. So at mid-March 2020, when the face-to-face fieldwork was suspended, we could move quite swiftly to using these other modes. So all of those sample members who were active at the time, they were allocated to interviewers. They got an additional letter sent to them, which had information about the interviewer not visiting and why that was. It included information about how they could log on and do their interview online. And interviewers, because we had this telephone mop-up, they already had a telephone version of the script. And so pretty much the next day, they could switch to phoning and doing telephone interviews. And then for the April sample, which went into the field a couple of weeks later, all adults were issued web first. So that includes that group who had been ring-fenced face-to-face, includes that group who were in the low propensity web households. They were all issued web first. And so they all got an invitation letter, an email with information about the study, why it's web first, and with their login details. And those people who would have been issued to interviewers, the letter also included information about interviewers can contact them by telephone for the interview. So in terms of the actual field work, it was pretty much a seamless transition from a priority web first followed by face-to-face survey into a completely web first with a telephone as the follow-up mode. We did make some minor changes in the summer for the waves 11 and 12 for the questionnaires that were still active. We added a new introduction to the survey. This was after we'd had a few people contacting our helpline. They were trying to be very helpful, and they weren't sure whether or not to answer the question as things normally would be, or to answer the questions as things are now. So we wanted to add some reassurance that, although these are odd times, if they could just answer according to the circumstances now. We also added a few additional response options here and there in things like employment status. So we added things like furlough. We added information about people receiving self-employment income support. And we added another short COVID-19 module, just collecting information about whether or not they'd had any symptoms, have they had any tests, if so, what are the results, have they received communication from the NHS about shielding. So the changes to the annual interview were fairly minor, and they were really to make it easier for people to answer the annual questionnaire. Now, the effect on response rates, we did find a a slight decline in response because obviously we're replacing face-to-face interviewing with telephone interviewing. So although response rates are still very high, they are lower than we would have liked. So that the grey line, the flat line there, is the target, what we're aiming for. Then wave 11 is the blue line, wave 12 is the red line. Some of these figures, they're projections, because obviously we have quite a long fieldwork period. Each sample month is in the field for 5.5 months or so. And so we do see a slight drop in response compared to earlier in the year. And this is for the general population sample. For the British Household Panel Survey, that sample, we see a similar thing, where there's been a drop. And then the ethnic minority boost, these are quarterly rather than monthly, because the ethnic minority boost each month is a relatively small sample, so the response rates do jump around quite a lot. So I've done quarterly response rates here to make it a bit smoother. So again, there's a slight drop, and then it's sort of plateaued. So the implications of this mode switch are that response is slightly lower, and we're working with our partners Kantar and NatCen to look at ways of sort of improving response on the telephone. We're also aware that there's potential for mode differences through selection, but also through measurement. So for part of the sample, this is the first time they've been invited to take part online, so the way they respond might be slightly different. For people who don't respond online, it's a telephone survey rather than face-to-face. However, the questionnaire is largely factual. There are very few sort of attitudinal questions, which tend to be the ones which are affected more by differences in modes. But we do have some planned analysis of mode effects during 2021. So we'll get the first quarter of data where this mode switch happened sort of early next year. And so throughout next year, we'll be sort of analysing the effects of this change. Those sort of have been the limitations of COVID-19 on the study, but COVID has also brought some opportunities for sort of new research and new science. And for a while now, for a few years, we've wished that we could send out questions via an SMS or email and just ask them, very quick, a couple of questions. So we were discussing this around the Scottish independence referendum, the Brexit referendum. Wouldn't it be great if we could do this and see what response we get, and if we can collect this information fairly soon to the decision point. And more broadly, we'd like to collect better data about life events. So we have an annual interview, and during that interview, we have an annual events module where we say, last time this was your situation. Is it the same now? Has it changed? And we try and collect information that's happened during the year. So if they've had a job change, if they've changed their marital status, if they've moved house, we try and collect all of that information to fill in that gap over the year. But we are aware that there are some things which people might forget in an annual interview. So if they've had a fairly short period of unemployment, they might forget to report that. And so it would be good if we could collect information closer to the point where these things happen. And also there are questions that can't really be collected very well retrospectively. So if someone does lose a job and you're sort of interviewing them 8 months later, if you want to know, about how they felt about that, their impact on their well-being, it's not something they can easily ask. If people do lose a job, what are their expectations of finding a job? What are their plans? What impact does that have on resources? This sort of information, you can collect it in an annual interview, but it would be much easier to collect it at the point where it happens. And so we started this project of looking at event-triggered data collection. So during 2018 and 19, we were doing quite a lot of development work on this. We commissioned some qualitative research about, what would understanding society respondents be willing to do? Under what conditions would they be willing to do it? We did some testing on an access panel, experimenting with different ways of inviting people and wording the questions. Some experiments are ongoing in the innovation panel. We also had a consultation on the content. And then at the beginning of this year, we started a monthly life events survey using our innovation panel, which is a panel of about 1,500 or so households, which we use for methodological testing. And so 2/3 of people on the innovation panel were invited to this monthly life event study, where they get an invite by SMS or email, and it goes through to a web survey, and we ask them just one question, did you experience any of the following during January 2020? And there's a list of half a dozen or so events. And if they say no, that's the end of the study. If they say yes, there's just a few follow-up surveys. So we launched that at the beginning of Feb, and then it's been monthly ever since. So on the first of the month, we say, thinking about the last calendar month, have any of these things happened to you? So this meant that when COVID-19 struck, we had a sort of infrastructure to be able to try this sort of event-triggered data collection. So, 23rd of March, we had government guidance, stay at home, work at home where you can. 17th of April, we sent out about 42,000 pre-notification letters to our Understanding Society sample members, telling them about what we were planning to have as a monthly COVID-19 study, why we're doing it, how we'll be doing it. And then on 24th of April, the invitations went out, and the fieldwork was limited to just 1 week. So we wanted the fieldwork to be fairly tight in time, because we were aware that things were changing quite quickly, and we wanted people to respond about more or less the same period of time. So it's fairly tight, fairly strict 1 week fieldwork period. Even though it was just 1 week, we managed to get almost 50% response from sample members who had taken part in the previous annual wave. It was slightly lower, about 42% for those who hadn't taken part, but the response was fairly good. And on the 29th of May, sort of just over 2 months after the stay-at-home guidance, the data were released by the UK Data Archive. They've been cleaned, created weights, derived variables, there was a user guide, and data documentation. And this whole COVID-19 survey is funded from the ESRC and the Health Foundation. And that funding just covers the data collection costs. It doesn't include a staff time or researcher time. So the UK HLS COVID-19 study, it's a 20-minute survey. We send invitations by SMS and email. For those people where we don't have an email address or a mobile phone number, we send letters, which includes a link and login details. It consists of web surveys, which took part in April, May, June, July, September. The November COVID-19 study started probably about 20 minutes ago. So that's in the field now for a week, and we're planning one for January as well. But we've also done a couple of telephone surveys. So we're aware that the sample we get from these web surveys may not be representative. So what we've done is we've drawn a sample of those who didn't respond to the April web survey and who live in a household where there's no one who's a regular web user. And that's the sample that we've used for telephone surveys. And we had our first telephone survey in May, and there's one this month as well. And the people that we get from the telephone surveys, they tend to be older, they tend to have more health problems, we have a high proportion of ethnic minority respondents in that group. And this is a really useful way of sort of bringing in people who we would otherwise be missing in the web survey. And Understanding Society, it's it's a survey that covers all age ranges. So we have youth surveys. So on the annual interview, 10 to 15-year-olds are asked to complete a paper self-completion survey. And we've got funding to do a strengths and difficulties questionnaire in July, which was just like a single page for the SDQ. And there's a full self-completion booklet, which is about 55, 60 questions, which is going out as well this month. So in November, it's quite a big month because we have the web survey, we have a telephone survey, and we have this youth self-completion survey. So the questionnaire, we try and keep the core content fairly stable, although things do change as the government keeps changing the rules. So we ask about household composition relationships, and the core is, asking about the coronavirus, long-term health conditions and access to healthcare. So are people finding it difficult to access healthcare for other problems they might have? Obviously, things like employment, finance, financial security, loneliness, and mental health are all big issues. But then we have quite a lot of rotating or occasional modules. We issue out consultations for people to suggest topics for us to cover. And so there's a quite large number of other modules that we cover, particularly things like homeschooling and return to school, where we collect the information at the child level. So that's been really useful for researchers. So some of the benefits of having this UKHLS COVID-19 study is that it has a much shorter turnaround, so we're able to respond to changes in policy. So for example, the Chancellor changed the rules about furlough on the 5th of November, just as we were scripting the November survey, so we were able to update the questionnaire for that November questionnaire, and we should get the data back from the web survey on the 4th of December. So it's much quicker than we could do on our annual survey. It's also a household survey, so we invite all adults in the household to participate, and so you can then look at the effects of experiences of one adult and how that affects other people in the household. We also obviously have a lot of information about our sample members, for some of them, almost 30 years. So we can draw on past information collected from other Understanding Society interviews to then see how this affects how people experience COVID-19. And we hope to be going back to these same people for the next years to come. And so we'll be able to link outcomes in data. And so we'll be able to see how people are affected in this odd period of COVID-19 and how that affects their future lives in years to come. So just a quick talk about the data. So we do have end user license data available from the data archive. So the most recent deposit includes the April, May, June, July web surveys, includes the May telephone surveys, the July youth survey. And we've also put together a 2019 pre-pandemic baseline data. So this is where we've got data from the latter half of wave 10 and the early half of wave 11, all collected during 2019, and we've packaged it together. So you've got some baseline data. And this is quite useful because otherwise wave 11 data wouldn't be released until 2021, but this gives people a chance to do more longitudinal analysis. And there's also special license data where you can link to low and super output areas or local authorities. And as well as the COVID survey and the data, we're trying to encourage full use of the COVID survey. So we put out briefing notes, we track media coverage. There's a large number of scientific papers already out there using the data. We have a lot of user support training videos. We're working with the UK Data Service and Closer to make the data easier to use and more visible. We're also part of a national core studies programme, and so as part of that, we're working within a consortium led by UCL to do some analysis on agreed topics, to do some additional data linkage, and also to invite our participants to do an antibody test. So hopefully early next year, we'll be asking our participants to test, and then we can link that information. And it's also part of a network of household panel surveys internationally through the CNEF, and so we're working with them to create harmonised files for comparative research. For more information about the Understanding Society COVID-19 survey, you can sort of check our webpage. That's where we put on the latest news and the latest publications. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I can see that we've got a question. So the question is, what factors are considered when you're looking at households with low propensity to respond to online modes?
Well, we were fortunate in that because we have this innovation panel, we experimented with web-first mixed mode in the 5th wave of the innovation panel. So that's, sort of 7-8 years ago now. And we've had a couple of waves of web-first data collection using the innovation panel before we rolled it out on the main survey. So we were able to use the information we got from the innovation panel to then model who took part online, because the allocation to mode on the innovation panel was completely random. So we didn't, even though we know about people's ownership of mobile devices and computers, and if they had broadband, we just allocated people to modes randomly. So that meant we can then have a look at those who are more and less likely to take part online. And so we sort of modeled that behavior and then used that to then model using understanding society main data who would be more and less likely to take part online. Yeah, so Peter, I think, has answered a question there also in the chat, because yeah, Peter is the person who actually worked on the model and managed the mode allocation.
Lovely, thank you. I can't see any other questions in the chat, so I was just going to give people an opportunity. If you have got a question, we've got a couple of minutes to take one now. If there are any questions, then feel free to email me whenever, and I'll do what I can to help. Lovely, thank you. Well, in that case, I'll say thank you to Jonathan. And if I can now introduce Stuart Grant, who's a research director at Kantar, and Joel Williams, who's the head of methods from Kantar, who are going to be speaking about adapting the crime survey for England and Wales. If we can hand over to Stuart and Joel, please.
Thank you again for inviting us. I should say in advance, hopefully this won't come true, but I've been suffering from the same IT gremlins as Ian at the outset, so hopefully I will be able to stay for the duration. As you've mentioned, it is a joint presentation between Joel and myself, and we are going to cover the crime survey. Before we go in to look at what we actually have done over the last 9 months, I just want to briefly give a bit of background to the survey itself. So obviously it's a very high profile survey measuring the extent of victimisation in England and Wales. It records personal experience of crime in the last 12 months and is key to monitoring level of crime in England and Wales, effectiveness of government policy, public confidence in the police and the criminal justice system. Clearly, it's widely reported in the press and in very many publications, and also used extensively to make a variety of policy decisions. It's been running for close to 40 years, and for the last 25 or so of those, it has been on CAPI. Now, obviously, there have been various adjustments to the sample and structure of the survey during that 25-year period, but broadly, the methodology has been relatively consistent since that switch. But as we all know, as every presentation has alluded to over the last 2 weeks, face-to-face fieldwork had to pause in March, on the 17th of March. And even in the run-up to that sort of pausing of face-to-face fieldwork, it was clear that we needed to develop an alternative methodology. There was clearly unprecedented change happening across the globe. And ultimately, demand for information wasn't diminishing. If anything, it was becoming more critical, and we needed to make sure we could maintain that independent assessment. Similarly as well, there was a sense that during lockdown, the nature and scale of crime could well be evolving, and we needed to be able to understand the nature of that change as well. Quickly, it was established that the most effective option was to switch to a CATI-based survey, utilising a recontact sample of previous participants who expressed a willingness to be recontacted. And I'm now going to hand over to Joel, who's going to take you through the next few slides, starting with sample and fieldwork design.
Thanks, Stuart. You're still okay to drive the,
I am, yes, that's right.
The slides. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, to begin with, talk about sampling and fieldwork design here. And in constructing these slides, whether they actually clarify what was an extremely complicated thing to do in an extremely short period of time, I will do my best. So there are a number of parameters that set aside for the design itself. The first one being that we stopped face-to-face interviewing in March, but the new survey had to be up and running in May, and it needed to be able to run for at least 9 months to the end of January 21. We since obviously need to be thinking beyond January 21, but that was the brief at that time. Second parameter is that it did need to be telephone interview data collection. The reason for this is that we've done quite a lot of previous work as to how far could the critical information that's collected in the crime survey be collected through a self-completion survey in its entirety, which would generally be online. And the results from that work had suggested that interviewers were quite critical in collecting the key information that's required to code incidents of victimization into specific categories that align with police recorded crime. So at least to begin with, that needed to be the method of data collection. But also with no other mode. And this is really a product of the speed of having to convert from the face-to-face interview design to a telephone interview design. Because, of course, unlike understanding society, there was nothing sitting there waiting to be adapted. So the whole thing had to be rewritten and rescripted in this timescale. And that means that an important part of the crime survey, which is placed in a self-completion module, could not be included in this new telephone crime survey. And Stuart will talk about that later on. We're also asked to see if we could approximately achieve same number of interviews in this telephone survey as we did for the classic face-to-face crime survey, which is pretty large, around 3,000 interviews a month. Just not quite yet, Stuart. Can I just go back to the previous slide?
Sorry.
And the final point is that clients ONS wanted to minimize non-coverage and non-response bias so far as that could be done. So there was no expectation that we could achieve the 70%-ish response rate that the classic crime survey had achieved. Next slide. So as Stuart has already said, our main solution was to use a pool of previous face-to-face crime survey respondents who'd given permission for us to recontact them on the same topic and supplied telephone numbers to us. And there was a kind of 2-year sort of time limit to that permission to recontact, which meant that the earliest people we could recontact were people that had been interviewed originally in May 2018. And we put a sort of hard stop basically at February 2020. So they would be the latest ones, essentially because the March field work essentially kind of tapered off without producing, say, necessarily a representative sample data set for that month. So overall, that was about 65,000 cases, of whom 42,000 or so were contactable on that basis. Now, the next line slightly odd, alluding really to what Ian was talking about earlier, the COVID infection study. In its early days, it required a sample from all sorts of places. And one of those places was this pool of respondents from the original crime survey. So about 4,000 or so were shifted out to the COVID infection survey from this. So that left about 38,000 for the telephone crime survey. And we made an assumption based on information in the labour force survey and elsewhere that we'd probably be able to achieve interviews with about 40% of those. So a maximum sample size of 15,000 or so, which clearly wouldn't last 9 months if we were trying to get 3,000 in each one. Next slide. So the solution needed to be a repeat interviewing model to maintain that sample size requirement. We, to some extent, adopted the kind of classic labour force survey panel design, in which there is a minimum of 3 months between interviews. And someday in each of these interviews, some of the data comes from that interview, but we don't constantly ask them about the same 12-month period for victimization incidents. Essentially, they're being updated as each interview is done. So there is some data sharing across interviews. So some of the victimization data may come from an earlier interview than the latest one. We also shifted the population definition for the individual level. Crime survey estimates are produced both at the individual level and the household level, but we shifted it from the individual level from 16 plus to 18 plus to deal with the fact that 16 and 17-year-olds who were still 16 and 17 there weren't too many of them in the pool. So they continue to be in there and were interviewed but excluded from estimation. So at some point they will turn 18 and then their data becomes useful for that purpose. But we needed to move that out because we didn't have another source to bring in. Otherwise, we'd be very much undercovering those. And it also means that when you're using a pool of previous respondents, the very recent immigrants are, of course, not covered, although the non-coverage is pretty low. We also use the data set from which the sample frame is drawn, so May 2018 through to February 2020. We use that entire data set as a kind of reference sample. So that data set essentially is a sample drawn from the population around that time with a 70% response rate. And it also has a lot of relevant data within it that we can use for non-response modelling, given that the response rate to this new telephone survey would be quite a lot lower, especially when you account for the kind of cumulative non-response. On top of that, there will be some contemporary calibration. So in this case, leaning on the labour force survey for information about gender and age and region structures, that sort of thing, that ONS has traditionally calibrated the sample to. Next slide. So these were our fieldwork assumptions in terms of the conversion rates. So we issued cases, how many do we get back? As I said, that we thought we'd be able to achieve a 40% response rate overall. We gave ourselves 3 months to achieve this. We thought we'd be up to about 28% after 1 month, and a little bit higher after 2 months, before finishing at 40% there. We then also thought that of those that completed the Wave 1 survey, we could probably get 70% of those to do a Wave 2 survey. And in terms of a Wave 3 survey, we'd still issue those that did not respond at Wave 2, so long as they had responded at Wave 1. But we built in some assumption of net attrition between those two stages, that if they had done the Wave 2 survey, then they were 75% of those would then do the Wave 3. But if they hadn't done, much fewer would. There'll be a net conversion rate of about 57%. So those are the assumptions we started off with, which were evidenced by the labour force survey, but of course the crime survey is different in many ways. So it remained to be seen how accurate that would prove to be. Next slide. This is a nightmare graph, I have to say. But the thing to do here is to ignore everything except the blue part of it. Essentially, there are the first time we issued cases was on May the 20th, 2020. The next time was about the same time in June, and effectively we're doing kind of monthly issues of cases to be for their first interview. Now, given that these are kind of data collection months, so we expected 70% of what we would get to be all done by the end of the first data collection month, 20% would come through in the second data collection month, and the final 10% in the third data collection month. So if you look at the first 3 columns and just look at the blue part of it, you can see the ratios there, 70, 20, 10. Then we look at the fourth data collection month. At this point, what we're doing is bringing people in who were interviewed in the very first data collection month, and they're getting their second interview. But not all of them will do that in the very first month of these Wave 2 interviews. So what the practical effect is that over time, the kind of ratio between months 1, 2, and 3 starts to soften. And you can kind of see that in the graph here, that the gaps between, say, the 4th and the 6th are smaller than between the 1st and the 3rd, and they're even smaller between the 7th and 9th. So that's effectively what's happening. What I've also done here is overlay all the other issue months as well. So the pale green part of the second data collection month, that's the second data issue month, and that progresses through using the same ratio process. And you can see here that in the first 2 months, we expected a larger sample size. Then we took cases out for the COVID infection study, and there was an effect of that, which not only reduced the number of interviews we were expecting in each of these data collection months, but also meant that it wasn't quite as even as it was originally planned to be. But you can see that at least that was the plan, that we wanted to achieve around 3,000 or so interviews each month. So we used a pretty simple algorithm in the solver algorithm within Excel to actually identify wave 1 issued samples per month across, so all the 9 issue months we were going to do, and selecting that so that there was a minimal variation in the interview sample sizes per month, putting all of the waves together. So that's how we worked that out. We used the original crime survey interview month as the primary stratum for allocating cases to their telephone survey issue month, and we tried to do that as proportionately as possible. But there was a complication in that this 2-year recontact agreement limited which months you could actually issue cases for. So if they had originally been issued in originally interviewed in May 2018 for the classic crime survey, they could only be issued in May 2020. They couldn't be issued at any other time. So that was obviously an element of complication. But within that, we attempted to systematically allocate cases to a telephone survey issue month by gender and by age, by the crime survey victim information, and then also by region. So the attempt was to make the issued sample each time round, although of different scale, to look more or less the same with respect to these various criteria. Next slide.
Okay, thanks, Joel. So we'll obviously come back to look at some of the early findings later on. I'm just going to go now through some of the further adjustments that were made, starting with the advanced materials. So in the standard approach, we would send out an advance letter to the household. Obviously, now we had a named respondent, and we were sending out the advance letter to them, but we also sending out further materials alongside that if we had the information. So respondents could also potentially receive an advanced email or advanced SMS as well. And roughly 2/3 or so of respondents had given us their email addresses previously or their mobile addresses, mobile numbers previously as well. So we had a lot of details that we were able to send out as part of that. Now, alongside the advanced letter, we sent out a book of first-class stamps. That was actually the same incentive that we were sending out on the original study. And we felt it was a very helpful to act as an aid memoir for those who had been interviewed some time ago. So obviously, as Joel mentioned, some people had given their permission back in May, June 2018 or so. So it had been some time since they'd actually had the connection. We felt using the same incentive would actually hopefully trigger that connection for them. Where we did vary, however, was that as part of the advanced letter, we told respondents that if they were willing to take part and indeed completed the survey, they would receive a further incentive. This would be a £10 conditional incentive. And similarly, anyone who subsequently completed that survey was told that they would be eligible for a further £10 incentive if they agreed to be recontacted and took part again. So those incentives for wave 2 and as alluded to, wave 3 are unconditional. So they are being used instead of the first class stamps for those people who are being sent advance letters for waves 2 and wave 3. As the other changes, the CATI survey itself had to be significantly shorter than its CAPI predecessor. So the most recent version of the CAPI questionnaire had 17 different modules, including 4 self-completion sections. But it was clear that the modified version would have to be much shorter to ensure that we had that successful transition, particularly given that we were so reliant on people being willing to be recontacted again. So I think Joel's already mentioned the fact that we decided to remove all the self-completion modules, but we also removed a number of other modules as well. So all the ones related to crime prevention and security. In effect, what we were doing was reducing the overall design from 17 modules to 6 modules, and those were very much geared around ensuring that we could understand the levels of crime that were happening during the COVID period. 5 of those modules were existing modules, albeit they were heavily modified, but we included 1 new module, which, not surprisingly, was very much focused around COVID-19 and how behaviour and perceptions had changed. And while the others were intended to be relatively static modules, that sixth module was very much seen as something that was relatively fluid, that could be amended on a month-by-month basis as circumstances changed. So, for example, as the first lockdown was softened and people could start going back to visiting shops and just being able to go and visit people, albeit for a shorter period of time than might otherwise have been expected. Now, overall, we made over 500 adjustments to the script. So we obviously reduced down from 17 modules to 6, but all of the remaining modules were simplified to make sure that we could maintain engagement throughout the interview. So some of those modules had limited amendments. There was one of the modules that we had kept, but we actually reduced it significantly. I think we ended up with only about 5 to 10% of the original content of that module. So, some of the adjustments were potentially obvious. Obviously, we're moving from CAPI to CATI, then we're having to tailor the wording accordingly, but others were less so. So in terms of the show cards, clearly that had been something that we couldn't carry on with the revised methodology. So we had a very detailed discussion around which questions we needed to keep, to make sure that ultimately, if we had to have a list of responses, we were not making that too onerous for the respondents. Similarly as well, whilst we'd removed all the self-completion modules, we did have a handful of sensitive questions that remained. And those were preempted at the very beginning. So before we even started the detail of the questionnaire, we were letting respondents know that there would be a small number of sensitive questions later on, and they might want to be somewhere private when they were completing the questionnaire. But we also then, when we got to those questions, gave a further warning and made it clear that they'd only have to answer yes or no to those questions to try and limit sort of how much they had to say at that particular moment. So we were very mindful of the fact that where we did have sensitive questions, we were trying to sort of gauge those appropriately. Now, as Joe has mentioned, we obviously have been looking at waves 2 and 3, and we're looking to reduce the burden on the respondents yet further for those later waves. So for waves 2 and onwards, certain questions where we've only recently collected the information, we have looked to skip those questions if there's been no changes in the intervening period. So we just look briefly at whether, for example, the same adults are in the household or the same number of children, and if that is the case and the circumstances haven't changed, then we just skip those questions completely. The other significant change from the first wave is the time period that the respondents are asked to consider. So as Joel has alluded to, the standard approach in the crime survey is to ask about the last 12 months, but going back 3 or 4 months later would be a lot of duplicated effort. So instead, when we go back to them on wave 2 and 3, we are instead asking them to tell us about what's happened since the date of the first interview. So that, again, reduces the length of the overall questionnaire. So we've obviously spoken about the fieldwork, the sample, the questionnaire, and the advanced materials. I just wanted to briefly talk around the interviewer panel as well. So I think some of the presentations last week, if not this week, have spoken about potentially switching to specialist telephone interviewers. For us, it was very much the case that it was critical that we kept our existing crime study interviewers. With all the changes that were happening around us, changes to the sample, the questionnaire, the mode, they were really the one constant that we had in that transition period. And ultimately, we'd spoken about them being the face of the survey in the past, and for this, they were very much going to be the voice of the survey, and their ability to sort of hit the targets that we were setting for ourselves was critical that they could sort of come on that journey with us. The key difference that we needed to stress for them was really about the fact that we had to work as a team going forward. So historically, they had worked on a set assignment, whereas now it was very much a case that they were able to access all the sample that was available to them on any one shift. So they had to be mindful of the fact that sometimes they would be setting up an interview that someone else would benefit from, and alternatively, they might well be the recipient in the future. So that was something that was quite a big departure for them, but we talked about that at length at the outset. And so, having had my stop-start presentation so far, we're just going to come on to a few slides on the performance to date. So we went live on the 20th of May, as Joel has mentioned. We didn't have the luxury of a pilot. Given the escalated time frame, we had to sort of work without that pilot stage, but we looked to address that as much as possible. So we had some very detailed interviewer briefings just to go through the changes, and that helped to have some minor refinements just before we went live. And similarly as well, we were having daily updates and sort of daily discussions in that first few days, just to make sure that there weren't any queries or confusions with the modified script, just to make sure that they were in the right place and sort of understood what was happening with all of those changes in a real world situation. And similarly, we were having very much weekly updates with the client at that point as well. Now, in terms of the response rates, Joel is going to go through this a bit more detail on the next slide, but we are above target at present, and our willingness to be recontacted is very, very high as well. It's almost universal at this stage, and it's actually been very consistent since those very first few weeks. We changed that much at all. Ultimately, given the change that we had to make, it has been seen as a template internally of other transitions from face-to-face to telephone that we have had to undertake over the last few months. But I'm now going to hand you back to Joel, who will take you through the last few slides.
Thanks, Stuart. So as Stuart has just said, the wave 1 response rate after 3 months, at least in the early cohorts, is 42%, which is slightly above the expectation of 40%, but certainly not so far above it as to spoil all our predictions. Wave 2, it's very early days. At the moment, it looks like the 70% response rate is probably a little conservative, and we will do a little bit better than that. But of course, we don't know finally about that, and we also don't know about wave 3. Actually, what turned out to be a rather critical thing, though, is that we were achieving far more interviews in the first data collection month than we anticipated. So we had planned for about 7 in 10 to be done in the first month. But in fact, it was more like 85% were done in the first month. Next slide. So going back to that chart, it meant really that the number of interviews achieved in the first couple of months was quite a lot more than expected. We also have done various other things, as I mentioned, the case removal for the COVID infection study. There was also some holding back of wave 2 until September the 1st, which was part way through the 4th data collection month. So there's various things that have muddied the waters. There's also that the data sets themselves are produced based on calendar month, so in terms of their actual interview. So May and June, we actually had about 6,500 completes. Most of those in June, over 5,000. July was 3,500, and August quite a lot lower, mainly because we front-loaded so much of that first month, and then it picks up to September. And our modelling going forward suggests that we will hover around the 3,000 or so mark for the remainder of the year, but it was obviously a little bit bumpy in the first few months. Next slide. In terms of sample biases that we can see, I think survey methodologists would expect all of these, to be honest. That we get an underrepresentation of households in major urban conurbations, people under 45, and especially sort of 25 to 34-year-olds. Households with children, which surprised me a little bit, people in paid work, and the overrepresentation is almost the sort of reverse of that. So suburban households, people in late middle age and early old age, and the white British population. To some extent, of course, we are doing a telephone survey and using all the sample that is available to us. So in that case, we're sort of beggars rather than choosers, so not being able to really select from the sample to sort of improve representation. But knowing about it is important, of course. Next slide. So in terms of the future, well, currently we are planning for a later end than January, January 2021. But in order to kind of, if we're maintaining the kind of design we've got at the moment, there is some thought that there should be a maximum number of waves that per individual, and this should be set at a reasonable level. So the labour force survey has a maximum of 5 waves per individual, And that's largely been what we've designed around. There's nothing particularly magic about 5 waves versus 6 waves or versus 4 waves, but some sort of line needs to be drawn there, given the accumulating risks of conditioning through doing the same survey over and over again, but also some perception of burden if the same individual's having to do something once every couple of months. So given that constraint, then we will need new wave 1 cases from at least August if we're to maintain the monthly sample size of 3,000. So that means that we need to trial alternatives in the first half of 2021 to bring new people in, because it's possible, but actually very unlikely, that classic face-to-face interviewing will be available much before August, and possibly not until much later than that. So therefore, we do need to trial some alternatives. And these alternatives may borrow from designs such as the labour force survey and the labour market survey that Ian discussed at the beginning, but ultimately will be tailored for the crime survey requirements, will look quite different. Anything we come up with, though, is very unlikely to match the classic crime survey face-to-face with respect to sample representativeness. So there will continue to be a strong role for weighting the sample that there is at the moment.
So a couple of quick questions. So what was the approximate average interview length for wave 1 and subsequent waves? And are victims of crime less likely to agree to be recontacted?
Well, are you talking in terms of the recontact? Are you talking about the original crime survey? So they weren't less likely to agree to be recontacted, conditional on, say, a few demographic characteristics, but because they were more likely to be younger people, then they were less likely to agree to recontact, whether they were a victim or not. So it wasn't a particularly strong predictor in that respect.
Okay, thank you. I think we probably
interview length. I think that would be.
So in terms of the interview length, apologies for dropping out again. The average interview length is 27 minutes or so.
Thank you. I think we probably need to leave it there, I'm afraid. I know there's probably a couple of questions that have gone unanswered, but we're really out of time for today. So I just wanted to say thank you very much to all of our speakers, to Ian and to Jonathan and to Stuart and Joel. A really interesting and engaging presentation. So thank you very much for sharing those with us today. I'd also like to thank Luz Martinez at the RSS for all the help with the technical support and organisation. And I'd also like to thank everyone in the audience for your participation and your questions, and apologies again that we didn't manage to get through all of those. But hopefully you found the session insightful and useful, and I wish you all a very good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today.